Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Ingrid Heckel, and I'm a conservation and land use specialist with the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program through a partnership with Cornell University. Welcome to the Conservation and Land Use 101 webinar series, which we launched back in 2019 to provide a foundation in important conservation and land use planning topics for members of Hudson Valley Conservation Advisory Councils and boards, as well as members of planning and zoning boards, elected officials, land trust staff, and interested citizens. Our guest speaker for today's webinar will be Gretchen Stevens of Hudsonia, who will provide an introduction to best practices for local environmental reviews. This webinar is especially geared toward members of municipal review agencies, though we think the concepts are applicable to other situations. Note that it will not go into detail about state environmental quality review procedures. Gretchen will, however, be sharing many ideas for how to create more proactive, thorough, and streamlined environmental review processes. But first, the Hudson River Estuary Program is a unique program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. We work throughout the 10 counties bordering the tidal Hudson River, shown on the map here, from Upper New York Harbor to the Federal Dam in Troy, to achieve many key benefits, including clean water, community resilience to climate change, the vital estuary ecosystem and its fish, wildlife, and habitats, natural scenery of the river valley, and opportunities for education, access, recreation, and inspiration on the river. Within the estuary program, our conservation and land use team works with municipalities, land trusts, and other partners to incorporate important habitats and natural areas into conservation and land use planning and decision making. We hope everyone is staying safe and healthy amidst the ongoing pandemic and appreciate your taking time to join us during this difficult period. Our team continues to work remotely, and we're planning some additional webinar training programs for the coming months. Our next webinar will be on July 23rd, when Beth Ressler from the Hudson River Estuary Trees for Tribs project will give an overview of stream conservation. We will also be holding a more in-depth program on identifying and protecting headwater streams as part of a 4-part webinar series in early August in partnership with Hudsonia. The latter program requires a brief application and is especially for municipal officials, conservation organization staff or volunteers, or others involved in local conservation and land use planning. I'll send out the links to register or apply for those events after today's webinar. Before I hand the presentation over to Gretchen, I'd like to quickly review some important webinar details. By now, you should have been able to connect to the audio through your computer or by phone. But if you get disconnected, you can find the call-in number and your unique attendee ID by clicking on the I information button in the top left corner of the window, or by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen to pull up the round telephone icon on the left. If you're having difficulties, you can direct questions via the Q&A box or the chat box in the bottom right corner of the screen. And you can send questions in during the presentation, but we will hold them until the end. We ask that you please refrain from asking any questions about specific development proposals or legal situations, which we can't address here. Note that your phone lines have been muted. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to the new Conservation and Land Use Webinars webpage after the event. We'll provide a follow-up email with the link. Also note that there will be a 3-question survey that pops up at the end of the webinar, and we really appreciate it if you'll take a moment to fill that out. And lastly, in light of our ongoing inability to offer in-person training programs this year, we will begin offering an email certificate for 1 hour of municipal training credit to webinar attendees. Anyone participating today should receive an automated email confirming attendance at today's program after the webinar. Today's presenter is Gretchen Stevens, the director of the Biodiversity Resources Center at Hudsonia. Gretchen has 35 years of experience in remote sensing, habitat assessment, habitat mapping, rare plant surveys, and other field biology in the Northeast and elsewhere in the U.S. She's co-author of the Biodiversity Assessment Manual for the Hudson River Estuary Corridor and has been a longtime partner of the Hudson River Estuary Program in delivering education programs to local land use decision makers throughout the Hudson Valley. At Hudsonia, Gretchen manages the GIS laboratory, curates the Bard College Field Station Herbarium, and supervises the habitat mapping program and biodiversity education program. With that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Gretchen and hope that you enjoy the webinar. So Gretchen, I'm going to pass you the ball right now and unmute you.
Okay, I'm in. Thank you, Ingrid. And hello, everyone. I'm glad you are all able to join us today. In this program, we're going and procedures for gathering natural resource information and applying conservation principles to environmental reviews of land development projects at the municipal level. We're going to describe these reviews from the perspective of municipal agencies, but the ideas apply to many other situations where an individual, an organization, or an agency is considering new land uses at a particular site. So we hope that you all will find the webinar worthwhile for your own purposes. Most municipal ordinances and comprehensive plans have an or intents section that describes the public interests that are meant to be served by the plan or the legislation, among many other interests such as economic prosperity and public safety. Most such statements also include protection of water resources and wildlife habitats and farmland and scenic vistas and other kinds of natural resources that are important to the public welfare. So we're going to discuss ways to use the routine reviews of proposed land development projects in view of those kinds of intents and purposes. The most typical kinds of projects that environmental impacts and approval at the municipal level are things like parcel subdivisions, site plans, zoning variances, and special permits. But other things such as comprehensive plans, zoning amendments, and other local legislation also must undergo an environmental review before they are approved and adopted. And the purpose of an environmental review is to figure out the kinds of impacts to resources of concern that might result from a proposed project, and to help design new land uses in ways that avoid or minimize harm as possible. We'll describe how to incorporate resource conservation concepts into these 7 steps in the review: gathering information about the site and the project, holding a pre-application meeting, reviewing the application, visiting the site, consulting with experts if needed, discussing project revisions with the applicant, and making final decisions. So what should a review consider? Certainly the scope of the proposed project, including the location and configuration of the developed features, the natural resources present be affected by new uses on the site, the resources of conservation concern that might be affected by the project, local, state, and federal regulations relevant to the site and the project, such as wetland or steep slope regulations, buffer zones, or stormwater management regulations. The responsibility of the reviewing agency is to determine the potential adverse impacts on natural resources of concern, and to help the applicant locate or design the development features in ways that avoid or minimize those impacts. So how should we go about this? For on-site and neighboring areas, you can get some of this from materials submitted by the applicant, but you should also consult the municipal comprehensive plan and zoning maps, online resources such as the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, any local knowledge or expertise that you can draw on, and your own observations when you visit the site. Webinar will give you links to some of the materials that can help you incorporate conservation ideas into your environmental reviews. Among them is this list of general conservation measures with these. Encourage development of altered land instead of unaltered land wherever possible, and promote redevelopment of brownfields and other previously altered sites, and infill development instead of breaking new ground in unaltered areas. New development along existing roads and near other developed areas instead of building new roads and driveways in undeveloped areas. This will help to avoid fragmentation of large contiguous habitat areas by roads, driveways, and other developed uses. Large forested area with meadows and wetlands over in the west and northwest, and an existing road running north and south. If you want to avoid fragmenting this large forest, then locating a new house close to the road would be a far better option than constructing this mile-long driveway to a new house site deep in the forest interior. Educating applicants about the ecological impacts of such a driveway can help to recruit them as partners in environmental conservation and perhaps to rethink their partner design, their project design. Establish and maintain broad buffer zones of natural vegetation along streams, along shores of other water bodies and wetlands, and around the perimeters of other sensitive habitats. This photo shows a forested buffer along a stream that runs through cropland. These kinds of farm fields are notorious sources of sediments, pesticides, and fertilizers that are damaging to stream water quality and habitats. But a well-vegetated buffer can intercept some of these materials before they enter the stream. Another farmland potential wherever possible. Discourage non-farm development on active farmland or on good farmland soils. And avoid fragmentation of continuous farmland by new roads, driveways, and other non-farm uses. Minimize areas of impervious surfaces, such as roofs, roads, parking lots, and driveways, and use a green infrastructure and other measures to facilitate on-sign retention and infiltration of stormwater runoff to help protect the quality and quantity of groundwater and surface. So forth. There are many more such measures listed here that can be applied to small and large-scale development projects in the Hudson Valley. Before reviewing a proposed project, reviewers should try to answer some basic questions about the site, such as, are there surface water or groundwater resources of concern on or near the site? Are there known areas of biological importance on or near the site? Of a large habitat area? Is there active prime or statewide important farmland soils? Or is the site in an area of recognized scenic importance? There are many other such questions, but it just gives you an idea of the kinds of things to be thinking about. Environmental quality review, or SEQR, is the basic tool in New York State for environmental assessment of a proposed project. It leads the applicant and the reviewing agencies through procedures and questions designed to describe the project and the potential impacts on important resources. When does SEQR come into play? Any state or local agency has the authority to issue a discretionary permit, license, or other approval for an action, or when any state or local agency funds or directly undertakes a project or adopts a resource management plan, rule, or policy that affects the environment. Early in the process, a project is classified into one of three categories. Type 1 actions are projects that are expected right from the start to have very significant environmental impacts. The secret process and what's called the full environmental assessment form, or full EAF, is required to be completed. A list of type 1 actions is given in the seeker law, and municipalities can make their own additions to the list if they choose. The town of Woodstock in Ulster County, for example, has developed their own environmental review law. It's referred to as the Town of Woodstock Environmental Quality Review, TWEQR, or tweaker, that lists additional actions as type 1. And the spectrum are type 2 actions, which are expected to have negligible process. Examples are things like fixing your porch or upgrading your septic system or repaving a town road. Many more are listed in the seeker law. Unlisted actions are all the other kinds of projects that fall in between. A seeker review is required for unlisted actions and what's called the short environmental assessment form, or short EAF, completed. The reviewing agency can require the full EAF for an unlisted action if they deem it necessary. In this webinar, I'm not going to go through, but I strongly encourage you to download the 2020 Seeker Handbook, which is likely to answer most of your questions. Hudsonia also prepared this 4-page Seeker fact sheet, which provides a quick overview of the purposes and processes of Seeker, and especially how to use it to incorporate biodiversity and water resource conservation into your review and to make the most of your project reviews. A link to the fact sheet will be provided to you at the end of the webinar. Seeker process and other kinds of environmental review in cursory ways. We strongly encourage you to use the review as an opportunity to learn about natural resources on the proposed development site and work with the applicant to ensure that any adverse impacts of the proposed project are minimized. To do this, you should insist on thorough and accurate answers to your questions about natural resources and the project design, and to think carefully about how to reduce the environmental impacts of new land use. I also encourage you to use the review process to collaborative relationship with the applicant right from the start, so that the final, while also protecting the interests of the community. The process will go most smoothly if the review procedures and requirements are spelled out clearly for both the applicant and the reviewing agency. For example, you could create a simple document that explains each of the steps of your review and the requirements of the applicant and the agency at each step. The 4 basic steps of the review are a pre-application meeting, preparation and submission of the completed application to the reviewing agency, the actual review, which should include the site visit. Before the initial development application is submitted by the landowner or developer, though, I strongly encourage the planning board or other agency to hold a pre-application meeting with the applicant. The applicant need not provide formal drawings at this stage or other materials that are expensive to prepare, but the purposes are simply to learn about the project's location and scope, to begin to identify site constraints, to inform the applicant about zoning or other restrictions in the local and to offer early feedback on the development proposal. Such a meeting is likely to benefit both the agency and the applicant by obtaining information about the municipality's concerns up front. The applicant can then design the project with those concerns in mind right from the start, and can in that way avoid costly redesign of the project later on. This can help to build a collaborative relationship between the two and can ultimately hasten the process of review and approval. This fact sheet on pre-application meetings link will be provided to you at the end of the webinar. To prepare a pre-application meeting, the reviewing agency, which is usually the planning board, would gather whatever existing information you can about the site. For example, check the comprehensive plan to see if the proposed project conforms with the municipality's vision for the town at that location. Check the zoning ordinance to see what kinds of uses are allowed there and what kinds of legal constraints may be applicable to the proposed project. Examine maps of topography and soils and wetlands, aerial photos, and others to learn what you can about the natural resources and the landscape in general. Many of these features can be viewed in the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, which is an online interactive map by the DEC and Cornell, and especially suited for this kind of purpose. There are other resources for natural resource information, but the Natural Resource Mapper pulls much of it together into a single map application where you can zoom to a location and selectively view layers alone or in combination. Then you can use the gathered information to identify any features that might act as environmental constraints on and near the proposed development site, such as wetlands, streams, flood zones, aquifers, steep slopes, active farmland or good farmland soils, large forests or large meadows or other large habitat areas, any important conservation areas such as those identified in the municipal comprehensive plan or open space plan. Gathering this information and analyzing the site is an excellent role for the Conservation Advisory Council or present it as a succinct oral or written summary, and even, if possible, project maps at a planning board meeting or zoning board meeting, illustrating these features for everyone to see. Then, at the pre-application meeting, learn as much as you can from the applicant about the proposed project. Explain what you know about the site and the physical and regulatory constraints that you're aware of so far. Explain the public interest in protecting certain natural resources, and discuss the project designs that natural resources of conservation concern. Also, at this stage, tell the applicant what kinds of additional information, if any, that you will need in order to better understand the site and the potential impacts. Things like if there are known or suspected wetlands on the site, a site plan would need to have the wetlands delineated by a wetland specialist and surveyed onto the plan. Remember that the wetland maps in the public domain, such as the New York State or federal wetland maps that you would see in the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, are both incomplete and not suitable for detailed site-specific planning. A habitat assessment by a qualified biologist can help you understand some of the ecological values of the site and which areas might be more or less sensitive to human disturbance. An inquiry to the New York Natural Heritage Program would tell you about any known occurrences of rare species on or near the site. If there are such occurrences, you could ask the applicant to have a biologist conduct a habitat assessment for those particular species. If a proposed driveway or other feature is located in hilly terrain, the detailed map of slopes to make sure that the project conforms to any steep slope regulations and that adequate erosion control and stormwater measures are in the plan. This discussion of environmental issues early in the planning process for a new project can lead to a more predictable and efficient review, and is likely to lead to better outcomes for the reviewers, the applicant, and the project itself. Especially for this purpose, we put together these habitat assessment guidelines that are intended to help applicants, planning board, ZBA, conservation board, or other reviewers, as well as the applicant, would need to understand the natural resources on the site and to better assess some of the potential impacts. The pre-application meeting would be an ideal time to provide guidelines like that to the applicant. So after the pre-application meeting, the applicant prepares the formal application and submits it to the reviewing agencies, such as the planning board, and the formal review begins. Conducted in perfunctory ways that do not consider the kinds of information that can be helpful to understanding the site or the potential impacts. We urge you to insist on thorough and accurate answers to the questions in the environmental assessment form and any other questions that can help you better understand the project and the resources that might be affected. To assist in the review, we put together this checklist to make sure that reviewing agencies have the information they need. Page 1 of the checklist is just a list of questions about the site, and page 2 has additional questions that can help you analyze adverse impacts. A few examples of the page 1 questions are these. Are there intermittent or perennial streams on or near the site? Are the streams classified as trout or trout spawning streams or sensitive cold water streams? Is there a mapped flood zone or riparian buffer zone on the site? Are there mapped wetlands or wetland soils on the site? Have wetlands been delineated on site, surveyed and mapped onto the site map? Are there prime or statewide important farmland soils on the site, an area of scenic importance to the municipality? A checklist like this can be incorporated into the formal site plan or subdivision application procedures, and even into the municipal code. The town of Rhinebeck, for example, in Dutchess County, has codified such a checklist into their subdivision law. In some cases, this information has not been provided by the applicant. And just remember that the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper can serve as a single go-to source for lots of natural resource information, such as streams, forests, some aspects of biodiversity, and important scenic and recreation areas. Then, an essential part of the environmental review is a site visit of the review agency, and the CAC or the Conservation Board should be equipped with maps, basic information about the site and the project, and the applicant or their representative should explain the proposed project layout. Seeing the site with your own eyes reveals things that are not apparent on two-dimensional maps and aerial photos. It brings important new questions. Sometimes the reviewers need expert help to review technical aspects of the site or the proposed project. For example, to verify or challenge a wetland delineation or a habitat assessment performed by the applicant's consultant, or to review the stormwater management or erosion control plan, and to recommend improvements to bring the project into compliance with municipal standards. Under the New York State Municipal Home Rule Law, the reasonable costs of passed on to the applicant. Once you feel you have identified the sensitive resources on the site, consider whether the proposed project is designed to avoid or minimize harm to those resources. Some of the questions on page 2 of the site assessment checklist are things like, are the proposed development features located outside of a mapped flood zone or an aquifer recharge area? Does the project preserve broad buffer zones along streams and wetlands? Does the project minimize fragmentation of large forests, large meadows, and good farmland? Preserve broad connectivity between on-site and off-site habitats? And is the project designed to minimize the adverse impacts on the scenic viewshed? Gathering and analyzing this kind of information for each site under review could be a routine assignment for the Conservation Advisory Council or Conservation Board. They could use this site assessment checklist or develop one of their own that covers an array of concerns particular to the local community. There are obvious roles in this for CACs, commissions, for those communities that are lucky enough to have such agencies. The CAC can develop a routine procedure for gathering and analyzing natural resource information and the regulatory status of any site that's under review. They can conduct site visits with the planning board, and they can prepare a report for the planning board that presents a summary of science-based information about the site, the regulatory implications for the project, and the CAC's own recommendations. The list of general conservation measures can remind you about resources when you're helping an applicant with their development proposal. So what kinds of things can you request or require of the applicant? Development features such as driveways or building envelopes can be relocated to reduce or avoid harm to sensitive areas. Broad buffer zones of undisturbed soils and vegetation can be established along streams, including intermittent streams, wetlands, and other sensitive areas. You can require stormwater management measurements to help ensure that water does not run rapidly off the site, but is in the soils and groundwater on site. You can ask that building heights be reduced, that buildings be screened with vegetation, that non-reflective materials be used for roofs and windows to reduce the visual impacts of the project on important scenic areas. You can ask that outdoor lighting be minimized, both to reduce the impacts on wildlife, many of which require dark environments during their activity periods, and to reduce the visual footprint of the project for humans, and so forth. There are many other ways that you can request or require that the project be resources. A question that often comes up in the course of an environmental review is this. We know that important and sensitive natural resources on this site under review are at risk from this proposed project, but our local code, our zoning ordinance or building codes or engineering standards does not explicitly extend protection to these resources? To what extent can we, the reviewing agency, require that important protected? Because of the threat of potential lawsuits from applicants, municipal agencies are understandably wary about imposing requirements that are not explicitly set forth in local legislation. But a few things to keep in mind. Municipal agencies are charged with carrying out their duties in ways that protect public health and safety. The statements in the introduction to your municipal comprehensive plan and the intents and purposes in the zoning ordinance are probably explicit in relating intact natural resources to the public welfare. What you find there. It's true that there are limits to what you can require that is not in the local code, but just as an applicant can raise a legal challenge to the reviewing agency for regulatory overreach, citizens can similarly challenge the agency for neglecting to take a hard look at environmental impacts and ignoring the public welfare in its reviews and decisions. Building a collaborative instead of an adversarial relationship with applicants, they will welcome reasonable ideas for environmental protections. I have seen applicants become willing partners once they've learned about the environmental benefits of conservation measures applied to their projects. So don't underestimate the value of educating the people that come before you about issues of concern to the community. In some cases, negotiating can help resolve an impasse. For example, in exchange for imposing a wider setback from a stream, say, you might offer to relax some other restrictions such as driveway width or building envelope dimensions. I've found that consultants who come before the reviewing agency repeatedly for different projects are likely to learn over time about the municipality's concerns for environmental protections and begin designing their projects to accommodate those concerns before they're asked. The final step is the decision on approval or denial of the proposed project. The decision should be based on the purposes and intent in the comprehensive plan, any specific requirements and restrictions in the zoning ordinance, the subdivision regulations, or other parts of the local code. Of the public interest at stake. If the approval includes any exceptions to the local code, a written explanation should outline the reasons for those exceptions and how the public interest is still preserved. So that's much of what I wanted to cover. I hope this has been a useful introduction to some of the ways to gather good information and incorporate resource conservation into environmental reviews. I want to remind you about other webinars in the Estuary Program's Land Use and Conservation Series, all of which are the past webinars are all available on the Estuary Program's website, and you'll be notified about the upcoming ones this year. Also, here is a link to the fact sheets and checklists and other resources that I mentioned. And you'll be given these also at the conclusion of the webinar. At this stage, I would be happy to answer any questions. If you have questions about the seeker process in particular, I urge you to consult the 2020 Seeker Handbook, which is an usable document. So I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid, who will MC the questions that some of you may have been posting in the chat box.
Thanks, Gretchen. Thank you for your presentation. And I know some people, there was a comment about the audio quality. I think it was a little bit broken up, but hopefully you were all able to follow the talk. We tried to work out the best connection. We're working from home, so thank you for bearing with us. I did see some questions come in through the chat and Q&A, and feel free to add additional questions. And also just a reminder that we can't answer questions about specific development proposals or legal questions in your community. So try to keep your questions general if possible. All right, so there's a question. How can you ensure that there is a proper review of things like vernal pool sites that are not on existing maps? Often these reviews are driven and or paid for by developers. How do you get a more independent review of these things? And I think you touched upon this in the presentation, Gretchen, but maybe you want to recap some of the tips you provided.
Do remember that the planning board or the zoning board of appeals has the authority to request the information they feel they need to conduct a proper review. If you, as a reviewer, suspect there are features on the site, such as vernal pools or intermittent streams that haven't appeared on the materials provided by the applicant, simply ask the applicant to go out and look further and improve their maps to you. If you feel that you need the expert help of an independent specialist, then you can call on someone independent from the applicant to double check a wetland identification or delineation, and provide that information to you independently. If need be, you can pass the costs of that kind of consultation on to the applicant.
Great. So next question. In our region, the best soils are usually the ones that are still open and farmed, while the remaining areas have second growth forest. Both these situations present valuable resources. How does one prioritize which would be better for a development?
Yes, so that question, that was about farmland soils in particular.
Well, about kind of the trade-offs between, siting a development in a forested area versus an area with good farmland soils.
Okay, I see. Yeah, those can be very different. And I don't have a good blanket answer. One thing I would say is always worth keeping in mind is that any new land use, new developed land use that is being cited, if it can be cited in a way that it does not fragment or minimizes fragmentation of either the good farmland areas or the forested areas or other important habitat areas, the better. The less fragmentation of any of those areas. Use, a non-farm use, is going to be cited on active farmland or inactive farmland with good farmland soils. The best idea, both from a agricultural perspective and a biodiversity perspective, would be to locate the new features at the edge of the farmland or the farmland soils. Similarly, if a new site is going, if a new project is going to be sited in or partially in a forest, as close as possible to the edge of the forest instead of deep in the forest interior. As for whether it's better to develop farmland or forest, I'm afraid that is something that needs to be answered on a site-specific and community-specific level, where farmland is scarce and precious in a community. That might be the higher priority. In a place where farmland is plentiful and forests are fewer, higher priority. Also specifics about the quality of in either case, if the forest is of especially high quality, undisturbed, old, and so forth, that might raise it for its conservation value. But I'm afraid those are questions that you would need to really answer on a site-specific basis.
Mm-hmm. Then we have a question about whether a planning board can request different maxes or minimums than allowed by the code.
Maxes or minimums. I'm not sure what that is referring to. If that's referring
maybe
to
like in the context of setbacks or widths of driveways, or I don't know.
Setbacks, right, or acreages or what, I am not sure. And I'm not sure I can actually answer that. I do think that planning boards have some discretion if they can, if there is a good sort of public interest that would be served by flexing those, but I can't tell you the actual breadth of their discretion.
And then someone asked, when should stormwater layout reviews be conducted in this process?
Yeah, that is something that that takes place during the actual formal review. If it makes sense for the applicant to lay out the sort of general maps and descriptions of the project initially, the planning board or the reviewing agency to give their general recommendations, and possibly do the stormwater management layout at a second stage, so that they're not wasting a lot of money on stormwater measures that would just have to be changed if the planning board is recommending some other kind of design. So it's definitely part of the formal review. It does not necessarily have to be part of the very first from the applicant.
Mm-hmm. Great. What are some themes you would use to educate applicants on why they should protect their natural resources? How do you convince someone who is not environmentally aware?
Well, that's a good question for which I'm not sure I have a good short answer. It is always good, and this would be appropriate, especially for the pre-application meeting, for the planning board to explain that might arise on the site, explain why they might be interested in the welfare of an intermittent stream, or a special habitat area, or a forest with old trees, or a very large meadow area. the more they can explain about their concerns, the more likely it is the applicant would understand and think that the concerns were legitimate for their. I think another very good role for a conservation advisory council, a conservation board, is to put together educational materials that can be simply handed out to applicants that provide good, clear, simple, science-based information about natural resources and the ecological services they provide to us, the human community, and the ways that they are threatened and the kinds of measures that can be applied to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess to that I would also just say, you know, oftentimes that if you can relate kind of the importance of a resource on a particular site to the surrounding area, understanding the context and how things are connected, that may help to build an argument about why it's in the public interest. These resources don't stop at property boundaries, but it's also, again, the more that you can insert this information when your community is updating a comprehensive plan or developing an open space plan, those are opportunities to really articulate these benefits, and hopefully then those documents can be referenced back to during future reviews. Okay, any advice for when a local CAC is kept out of the environmental reviews process by a planning board and town consultants, regardless of the town law?
That is where the planning board does not invite the CAC to help with the review or provide advice. I guess what I would say is I think that it's very important as early as possible to establish a good working and constructive relationship between the CAC and the planning board. And I know that planning boards are often reluctant to invite CACs just for, the more the CAC can inspire the trust of the planning board, the more likely the planning board will be to invite them to help. One thing that I recommend is that early on, the CAC, even before they're reviewing projects with the planning board, simply offer to do other helpful things for the planning board. Gather information that they know the planning board would find useful for their reviews. Provide them information in a collaborative and constructive way. The more useful you can be to the planning board, the more likely they will want to call on you when they need your help in the future. So I think that's the best advice I can give is to build that relationship in other ways before you are maybe able to assist with those reviews. The more they learn to trust you and understand that you are interested in, the more likely they will want to have you help them with those reviews.
I agree with that. There's a question about determining the size of buffer widths to protect streams. And there are a couple of publications available from the Environmental Law Institute. One of them is Conservation Thresholds for Land Use Planners. There's also a Local Planner's Guide to Wetland Buffers, but that also, I think, is somewhat applicable to thinking about stream buffers and presents some science around different buffer widths. But I would encourage you to stay tuned and come back for the July 23rd webinar about stream conservation. And there will be some other programs later in August and September specifically about stream protection. So, but Gretchen, do you want to say anything about stream buffer widths?
Yeah, I would just say this. You would want to think about buffer widths differently depending on what your purposes are. And in some cases, depending on the actual landscape, the soils, the slopes, the nearby land uses, and so forth. But if you're thinking about this to codify certain buffer widths, I would urge you to look at the documents that Ingrid just mentioned from the Environmental Law Institute. In many cases, lots of communities do establish buffer widths of, 50 feet or 100 feet. And those are adequate for certain purposes. Larger buffer widths are really needed if you're concerned about certain kinds of wildlife, but they may be politically impossible to put into local legislation. ELI will probably help you a lot to think about the widths that might be appropriate in your case.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question. If a municipality has a significant habitat map, what are the options for developing ordinances around this map? For example, an overlay map could be developed, but what would it be directed to preserve?
Yeah, that's I think what I would recommend, and I'll just say this, I think the questioner is referring to one of the town laws of significant habitats that have been prepared by Hudsonia over the years. Most communities do not have such a map, but these are fairly detailed maps of habitats. It might be that the best thing would be to simply put into it could be in the zoning law, the procedures that are in the zoning law, or the procedures that are followed by the planning board or the zoning board, to refer to the significant habitat map. The conservation recommendations that are in the report that accompanies that map, and consider those recommendations in the review. If you wanted to be more specific, you could have special requirements that are related to the so-called priority habitats that are described in the reports that accompany those maps. Those are habitats that are in many cases rare, in many cases support and maybe especially sensitive to human disturbances. So I think that's the best I could say. There could be, if there are areas of the municipality where some of those priority habitats are concentrated, you could consider developing a conservation overlay zone that encompass some of those concentration areas, or possibly a critical environmental area, which is a different way of drawing attention to those places that may be especially sensitive.
Great. So we're almost at 1 o'clock. Let's do maybe one more question. I'm going to combine two of them. Someone asked whether a review board can require a scientific expert, like a habitat specialist hired by an applicant, to come before the board to answer their questions directly. And related to that, is there a listing of where to find the different types of experts that might be needed for a review? And I know you had a slide that mentioned some of those types of outside consultants that might be brought in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very common. Their engineer come before the planning board to explain some of the technical aspects of the project. And the planning board could certainly ask the applicant to have their biological consultant or their wetland specialist or another expert, their hydrogeologist, to come before the planning board. That would be a very legitimate request.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gretchen, for your presentation and answering these questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. Gretchen, did you have 1 or 2 more clicks to get to your contact information on this last slide? I think you can follow up with Gretchen or myself with some of these questions. We'll try to get back to you, and we will be sending out a follow-up email probably on Friday with links to the recorded webinar and slides, and also to the different resources that Gretchen referenced in her presentation and that have come up in this discussion. So stay tuned for that. And when you leave this webinar, you should be getting a confirmation of your attendance as well. So thank you everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope you will join us again for the next webinar on stream conservation. Have a great day.